I wanted to make a little follow-up on the video that I did last night. I received a well-considered comment on that video, and I should probably clarify my position on this. When I said that the situation in Ukraine isn't serious, that was probably a mistake to say that because the situation is indeed very serious. Probably what I meant to say, or which I should have made more clear, is that it's not on the level of, let's say, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay. So, yes, the situation is serious, particularly for the people in Ukraine, because they're essentially in the midst of a power game between larger geopolitical forces, which each have their own interest sphere in that region. So. I I want to follow up today by simply reading an article, and this is I don't intend to infringe on any copyright or anything like that. This is purely for educational purposes of my audience, and it's for non-commercial purposes only. In other words, you're probably not going to be authorized to repost this without giving credit to the original article, and I will post a link to that article. This article is essentially explaining some of the history behind what's going on here in behind what's going on in the Ukraine. So it is written by Jeffrey Sommers and Michael Hudson, and it was posted on Counterpunch today. Russia's invasion, if you prefer, into Crimea, with prospects for movement into eastern Ukraine, is the culmination of US/NATO policy since 1991. The unraveling of the USSR and its Soviet bloc, the Warsaw Pact, dismantled one of the largest empires in modern history. Even more striking, it was the most peaceful dissolution of a major empire in history. The fact that an empire stretching over a dozen time zones, that included hundreds of ethnic groups with concrete historical and contemporary grievances with each other, broke up without a bloodbath, is nothing short of miraculous, and a reflection of the destruction of spirit and even of economic understanding that marked the distortions of Stalinism, neither capitalist nor socialist, but a bureaucratic collectivism whose final stage proved to be kleptocracy. Kleptocracy. Part of the reason that this went off with such little violence was due to the mutual desire of President George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev to end the Cold War's threat of mutually assured destruction. Gorbachev, for his part, recognized that the Warsaw Pact nations needed to be let go in order to free resources to build up a more middle-class consumer society or economy. Demilitarization was to be achieved by disarmament. All the more remarkable in view of the largest human losses suffered in the world history from military invasion had occurred just 2 generations earlier, Germany became the focus pending its reunification in 1990. It had invaded its neighbors every generation or so since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. In World War II, it laid waste to the USSR and left 25 million of its people dead. Other East European nations, including Romania, and along with its victims of Stalinist oppression, in other words, the Baltics, the Ukrainians, welcomed the Nazis and fought against Russia. The NATO alliance thus remained the main threat that had held the Soviet Union together. So Russia had vital security concerns that could only be met back then in the 1990s, that could only be met by assurances that NATO would not move into the Warsaw Pact states, or former states, where so much Soviet blood had been shed during World War II. President George H.W. Bush, not W. Bush, made assurances that if the Soviets were to dissolve the Warsaw Pact, Russia must be assured that NATO would not fill that vacuum. But his successor, Bill Clinton, broke this promise by quickly taking the former Warsaw Pact states into NATO, or at least some of them, and then moved into territory formerly occupied and incorporated it, which was formally incorporated into the USSR, and basically this started with the Baltics. It should have been foreseen and probably was inevitable that these new entrants wanted NATO, given their own experience with Soviet occupation. But the eagerness of a triumphalist United States to surround Russia militarily, rather than disarm, led Russia's leaders to feel betrayed by the US breaking its word. Remember, this is a sort of all over triumphalism that we're talking about here. Russia today has watched covert attempts from the United States, from the U.S. State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy and other NGOs to break their country as part of what was becoming a globalist pattern on the part of the United States. Today's confrontation has taken on an existential character for Russia since it saw NATO's moves towards Georgia as cutting too close to the bone. Now remember, this just happened a few years ago. This was the Orange Revolution I was talking about yesterday. The prospects of NATO assimilating Ukraine/Kiev represents a seizure of Russia's heart, the very ancestral home where Russia was founded on and on which it repelled the fascist invasion in this, what they call the Great Patriotic War, as it had a millennium earlier against the German crusading knights, and so on. So this history goes way back. Most Russians never forgave Gorbachev for the deal that he made with NATO. Russian diplomats have stated clearly that Ukraine is a line that cannot be crossed regarding potential NATO expansion. It is as if foreign agents working in Texas were to mobilize a violent ethnic minority to rejoin Mexico and then place hostile military alliances on the US border. The Crimea has been part of Russia for 300 years. It's populated overwhelmingly by Russian speakers who watch with alarm the right-wing nationalist violence in Kiev, all the more as many of its leaders are establishing symbolic and outright ideological ties with the old German Nazis. Viktor Yanukovych was as much a crook as Ukraine's previous kleptomaniac leaders who wielded political power to basically rob the states and public domain neoliberal style. The Crimean population has reason to fear that their elected president was illegally disposed, not for his kleptocracy, but as part of a regional and ethnic identity politics of the sort that the Americans are sponsoring throughout the world, from the Shiite-Sunni divisions to similar splits in countries they seek to control or bring under their sphere of influence. The only protection available is from Russia. That is the gift that Obama has given Putin, making him a defender of Ukraine rather than the aggressor. Khrushchev's drinking bout in 1954, when he turned Crimea over to Ukraine, has caused a massive hangover. The West's response to cure this with neoliberalism and NATO is not helping. I will post a direct link to this article on Counterpunch. There, I'm going to post another link to to another article after this, and also from Counterpunch. I have various other sources. It's you're not going to hear this in the U.S. mainstream media, and you can rest assured that this situation hopefully will not, escalate into some sort of a nuclear confrontation. Um, it is quite complicated, but I think we should all be very glad at this point that the 1,200 nuclear missiles, which were formerly stationed in the Ukraine via Russia, are no longer there. They were handed over to Russia or destroyed during the nuclear arms treaties between the United States and Russia. The Ukraine at that point, way back when, signed a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And it would also be interesting to see now, particularly, since the U.S. State Department is trying to convince Iran that they are not to have any kind of nuclear weapons capabilities. We also need to remember here that Russia played part in those negotiations to convince Iran not to build nuclear weapons, as it basically also stepped into this whole fray with Syria when Russia said, let's pull back here. There are no military solutions in Syria. Everything is going to be made worse. So you see, the Ukraine is mainly, as far as these geopolitical games are concerned, a piece on the chessboard. The Ukrainian people, more than likely, are going to lose either way. If they go with the West, they're going to be screwed through IMF loans. their economy will be in debt forever. Austerity measures will be imposed. And if they go with the East, with Russia, well, then they're going to be under their sphere of influence while still getting some cheaper gas prices, or rather, oil prices for the moment. My belief is that eventually the at least the Crimea portion of the Ukraine will possibly be split off from the larger portion of Ukraine. I mean, nobody knows how this is going to play out. But that is just my follow-up on, yesterday's video. I'm not exactly ignorant of the internal politics in Europe or the internal machinations in the US. The last thing the United States of America needs right now is to get involved in another war. Good night.